A warning shot? Or the first crack in a system already under pressure? In the Strait of Hormuz, Iran's IRGC opens fire on a passing container ship. Tehran says it was ignored warnings, calling the move justified. But the timing is what makes this moment dangerous. Planned ceasefire talks with Washington have quietly unraveled before they even began. Just days earlier, U.S. forces had already fired, seized an Iranian-linked vessel, and stormed a tanker in the Indian Ocean. These are not random incidents, they're signals. Signals of a maritime chessboard tightening, move by move. The real question is no longer what happened, but what comes next. Now, please continue watching the news broadcast for the most detailed perspective. Listen to the sound of the Persian Gulf. It is a quiet, heavy, deceptive sound. For decades, the waters of the Strait of Hormuz have acted as the grand theater of global geopolitics, a narrow strip of ocean where the survival of the modern economic system balances on the edge of a knife. But beneath the surface of these waters, a new kind of war is being waged. It is not a war of aircraft carriers, stealth bombers, or amphibious invasions. It is a war of the mind. It is a war of perception, of strategic messaging, and of narrative control. And today, the silence of that theater was violently shattered. Not by a random act of piracy, not by an unhinged rogue commander looking for glory. The gunfire that echoed across the Strait of Hormuz, striking the reinforced steel hull of a commercial container ship, was something far more precise and far more dangerous. It was a carefully, perfectly timed, and brutally executed diplomatic cable written exclusively in the language of ballistics. When the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, opened fire on that commercial vessel, the immediate reaction across the globe was predictable panic. Western media networks instantly scrambled to their breaking news desks. The chyrons at the bottom of the screen flashed bright red. The anchors, breathless and alarmed, spoke of unprovoked aggression, of an irrational state actor lashing out blindly, and of the imminent, catastrophic collapse of global shipping. But if you strip away the hysteria, if you look closely at the physical reality of the steel on that container ship, you will notice something deeply revealing. The ship did not sink. The cargo was not incinerated. The crew was not decimated. The gunfire was precise, it was restrained, and it was entirely performative. This is not a story about naval combat in the 21st century. This is a masterclass in narrative warfare. This is a story about what happens when the traditional doors of diplomacy are slammed shut by Washington and Tehran decides to open an entirely new channel of communication using the only vocabulary the West cannot ignore. To truly understand what just happened in the Strait of Hormuz, we have to look away from the physical bullet holes. We have to look at the invisible, psychological battlefield, the architecture of strategic messaging, and the relentless, unforgiving war for perception that is currently rewriting the fundamental rules of the Middle East. Let us pull back the curtain and examine the actual timeline of events, because context in narrative warfare is everything. For weeks, the international community had been holding its collective breath, waiting for a highly anticipated, incredibly high-stakes diplomatic summit that was scheduled to take place in Pakistan. This was supposed to be a vital back-channel negotiation between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran. It was framed as a chance to de-escalate simmering tensions, a chance to find a geopolitical off-ramp before the region spiraled into an uncontrollable conflict. But diplomacy is not a magical cure-all. Diplomacy requires a baseline of mutual trust, or at the very absolute minimum, a baseline of mutual restraint. Washington, however, decided to play a completely different, highly aggressive, psychological game. They believed they could dictate the terms of the narrative before the diplomats even sat down. Just days before the negotiators were supposed to meet at the table in Pakistan, the United States military made a calculated, kinetic move on the geopolitical chessboard. Operating under the self-proclaimed banner of enforcing international sanctions and upholding the so-called rules-based global order, American naval forces intercepted an Iranian-linked commercial vessel. They fired warning shots. They forcefully boarded the ship. They seized control of the vessel and its cargo. And as if to ensure the message was received loud and clear, shortly after that incident, halfway across the world in the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean, American military forces staged yet another aggressive boarding operation on another oil tanker connected to Iranian economic interests. In the Western press, and within the briefing rooms of the Pentagon and the State Department, this was immediately framed as a routine law enforcement operation. It was sanitized for public consumption, a simple, necessary policing action on the high seas to stop illicit trade and enforce international mandates. That is the American narrative. It is clean, it is clinical, it is legally sterile, and it casts the United States in its favorite role, the righteous, unwavering sheriff of the global oceans. The cognitive goal of this narrative is to legitimize American aggression while delegitimizing any Iranian resistance. But narrative warfare requires you to step out of your own echo chamber. You must put yourself in the command centers of Tehran. You must look through the strategic, deeply suspicious lens of the IRGC command structure. To them, this was not a policing action. It was not law enforcement. It was an ambush. It was an act of maritime piracy conducted under the diplomatic camouflage of international law. To the Iranian leadership, Washington's actions on the high seas sent a glaring, undeniable, and highly offensive message. The message was that the United States does not actually respect the diplomatic process in Pakistan. The United States will use the illusion of impending peace talks to lower Tehran's guard, only to strike at sovereign Iranian assets in the open ocean to gain leverage. Instantly, the entire premise of the Pakistan talks was rendered toxic. The psychological environment was poisoned. How can you, as a sovereign nation, sit across a negotiating table from a partner who is actively hijacking your commercial logistics networks in the Indian Ocean? You cannot. To do so would be to accept a posture of submission. The talks collapsed before they even began. The diplomatic channel went entirely dark. And in that sudden, terrifying vacuum, a profound psychological pressure began to build inside the Iranian military apparatus. The United States had made a massive, potentially catastrophic psychological gamble. The decision-makers in Washington believed that by applying maximum kinetic pressure on the high seas right before a diplomatic summit, they could humiliate Iran, demonstrate total, unchallengeable naval supremacy, and force Tehran to the negotiating table from a position of absolute weakness and fear. The American cognitive strategy was designed to induce paralysis. They wanted to make the Iranian leadership feel surrounded, outgunned, diplomatically isolated, and entirely outmaneuvered. But Washington fundamentally misunderstood the psychology and the historical memory of their adversary. Iran does not capitulate to maritime bullying. The modern Iranian state survives, and in many ways thrives, on the doctrine of asymmetric deterrence. In the Iranian strategic playbook, which has been written over decades of brutal isolation, an unanswered provocation is the ultimate sin. It is an invitation for absolute destruction. If America can arbitrarily seize Iranian ships in the vastness of the Indian Ocean and face absolutely no consequences, then Iranian sovereignty is nothing but a fragile illusion. A psychological red line had been crossed, not just on the physical water, but in the cognitive theater of war, where the true balance of power is decided. Tehran knew they had to respond. But the question of how to respond is the essence of strategic brilliance. A conventional military strike on an American destroyer or aircraft carrier would trigger a catastrophic, asymmetrical regional war that Iran would ultimately lose. That is exactly what Tehran wants to avoid. But doing nothing, releasing a weak statement of condemnation from the foreign ministry, would project fatal weakness to their allies, their proxies, and their enemies. The solution had to be perfectly calibrated. It had to be symmetrical in its narrative impact, yet asymmetrical in its execution. It had to be a mirror image of the American action. It had to restore the balance of terror and reestablish deterrence without triggering a full-scale American military invasion. Enter the Strait of Hormuz. It is the ultimate global choke point. It is the jugular vein of the global capitalist machine, where 20% of the world's oil supply transits daily. It is a place where geography itself is a weapon of mass disruption. When the IRGC fast boats approached the container ship in the strait, the commanders were not looking for blood. They were not looking to create martyrs or sink thousands of tons of steel to the bottom of the ocean. They were looking for the global microphone. They leveled their weapons. They opened fire. The bullets hit the steel hull of the commercial ship, and in that fraction of a second, the narrative shockwave rippled outward, moving faster than the speed of sound, instantly hitting the trading floors of every major financial capital on Earth. This is where we must decode the absolute brilliance of the Iranian narrative counteroffensive. Almost immediately after the physical trigger was pulled, the Iranian state media apparatus went to work with terrifying precision. Noor News and the Fars News Agency, which serve as the primary arteries of Iranian strategic communication, did not release wild, apocalyptic threats. They did not publish unhinged manifestos declaring a holy war against the West. They did not boast about their military might in hyperbolic terms. Instead, they did something far more devastating. They used a vocabulary that was chillingly familiar to Washington. The Iranian media networks declared that the IRGC had acted to, quote, legally enforce Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz. They explicitly stated that the commercial container ship was targeted only because it had, quote, ignored the warnings of the Iranian armed forces. Do you hear the echo? Do you recognize the geopolitical framing? This is the core of the psychological operation. Iran was taking the exact same sanitized, bureaucratic language that the United States uses to justify its own global policing actions, and they were feeding it right back into the mouth of the Pentagon. This is the ultimate form of cognitive mirroring in modern narrative warfare. Think about the psychological trap this creates. When America forcefully boards a ship in the Indian Ocean, Washington calls it enforcing the law. When Iran shoots at a ship in the Strait of Hormuz, Tehran calls it enforcing the law. By utilizing the specific vocabulary of legal jurisdiction, sovereign right, and maritime compliance, Tehran is violently rejecting the American label of a rogue state. They are refusing to play the villain in the American script. Tehran is violently rejecting the American label of a rogue state. They are refusing to play the villain in the American script. Instead, they are claiming absolute legitimacy. They are telling the world, and specifically the multi-trillion-dollar maritime shipping industry, that the United States is not the only superpower that gets to dictate the rules of navigation. The narrative they are projecting is incredibly simple and undeniably potent. The United States claims jurisdiction over the Indian Ocean. Fine. Iran claims jurisdiction over Hormuz. You touch our logistics networks, we touch yours. You enforce your rules with boarding parties, we enforce our rules with heavy machine guns. It is a tit-for-tat diplomacy executed not by men in suits carrying briefcases, but by fast boats carrying live ammunition. This is precisely where the physical battlefield and the psychological battlefield merge into one terrifying, indistinguishable reality. The West can deny Iran's legitimacy all they want. The United States State Department can issue 1,000 perfectly written press releases condemning the action as reckless, destabilizing, and illegal. The president can stand at a podium and declare Iran a threat to global peace. But narrative warfare is not a debate tournament. It is not about who holds the moral high ground or who has the best lawyers. It is about who can manipulate the physical reality on the ground to force a specific strategic outcome. Let us look at the real-world, kinetic impact of this carefully constructed narrative. The intended audience for this gunfire was never the captain of the container ship. The captain was merely an extra in the play. The true audience was the men in tailored suits, sitting in the boardrooms of London, New York, Geneva, and Tokyo. The audience was the global maritime insurance industry, the risk assessors, and the algorithmic trading systems that dictate the price of energy. Institutions like Lloyd's of London do not care about American political rhetoric. They do not care about the State Department's definition of freedom of navigation. They care about one thing and one thing only: systemic risk. When a commercial vessel is fired upon by a state military force in the Strait of Hormuz, the mathematical risk matrix explodes. War risk premiums skyrocket instantly. The cost of moving a single barrel of oil or a single shipping container through the Persian Gulf multiplies overnight. Shipping companies panic. Captains refuse to sail. Supply chains, already fragile, begin to shudder and crack. And suddenly, the economic cost of Washington's aggressive, supposedly cost-free posture in the Indian Ocean becomes devastatingly clear to the American consumer. Iran is effectively weaponizing the global economy without dropping a single bomb on American soil. By successfully creating the perception of an unsafe ocean, Tehran is applying massive, uncontrollable, psychological, and economic pressure directly onto the policymakers sitting in the White House. The Iranian narrative is screaming a very clear, highly credible warning. If you try to strangle our economy through illegal seizures and maximum pressure on the high seas, we will simply strangle the global economy right at the source. You may have the mighty Fifth Fleet. You may have aircraft carriers. But we have our hand resting firmly on the light switch of the world's energy supply, and we are not afraid to plunge the room into darkness. This is the absolute pinnacle of strategic messaging. It is a psychological operation designed to isolate the adversary, divide their coalitions, and paralyze their command structure. Washington now faces an agonizing, nearly impossible dilemma, and this dilemma was engineered entirely by Tehran's brilliant narrative framing. Let us analyze the trap Washington is now caught in. If the United States chooses to retaliate militarily against Iran for this shooting, if they launch cruise missiles or airstrikes against IRGC naval bases, they will instantly be seen by the global community as the primary aggressors. They will be blamed for sparking a massive global energy crisis over a commercial ship that, in reality, only suffered cosmetic damage. They will alienate their European and Asian allies who desperately need that specific shipping lane to remain open at all costs to prevent domestic recessions. Furthermore, the Iranian framing of sovereign defense will look completely justified in the eyes of the global South. Iran will play the victim of American imperialism perfectly, pointing to the bullet holes on their own ships as proof. But look at the alternative. If the United States does nothing, if they back down, issue empty threats, and absorb the blow without a kinetic response, then Iran has successfully established a new, terrifying norm. Tehran will have categorically proven to the world that they can exert kinetic control over the Strait of Hormuz, hold global shipping hostage, enforce their own version of maritime law with live fire, and face absolutely zero consequences from the American empire. They will have fundamentally shattered the long-held illusion of American naval omnipotence. This is the dark genius of the Iranian maneuver. By taking a minor tactical skirmish and elevating it into a massive strategic narrative, they have frozen the American decision-making apparatus. They have turned American military strength into a geopolitical liability. So, what are the next escalation scenarios in this relentless cognitive war? The battlefield of perception is constantly shifting, never static, and by understanding the mechanics of narrative warfare, we can map out the immediate future of this conflict. Scenario 1 is the normalization of the gray zone, and it is highly likely. The tit-for-tat dynamic we just witnessed does not escalate into a world war, but rather becomes the new, grinding, permanent reality of the Middle East. The United States occasionally seizes an Iranian ship under the guise of sanctions enforcement. Iran immediately retaliates by harassing or firing upon a Western-linked vessel under the guise of territorial defense. Both sides pump out perfectly crafted, legally dense press releases claiming the moral and legal high ground. The actual kinetic actions remain low-level, designed to avoid mass casualties, but the cognitive warfare is deafening. In this scenario, Iran wins the long game. Why? Because every single day that Iran successfully projects hard power in the Strait of Hormuz is a day the American security umbrella looks a little more fragile, a little more hollow. The foundational narrative of unquestioned, unchallengeable U.S. global dominance slowly bleeds out into the ocean. Scenario 2 is the proxy swarm, or the franchising of the narrative. Having firmly established its own willingness to use direct force and successfully framed it as legal resistance, Tehran begins to export this specific narrative to its vast network of allied proxy forces across the region. If the U.S. continues its maritime aggression, the response won't just come from the IRGC fast boats in Hormuz. It will be localized, heavily armed forces in the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and the Gulf of Oman, all echoing the exact same Iranian narrative of resisting Western maritime piracy. The psychological pressure on the U.S. Navy would become immense, almost unbearable. They would find themselves fighting ghosts, chasing shadows across 1 million square miles of ocean, bleeding billions of dollars in resources, all while fighting a decentralized enemy that controls the overarching storyline of indigenous resistance against an occupying empire. Scenario 3, and perhaps the most dangerous and strategically complex, is the diplomatic weaponization of fear. Having proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that they can strike the global economy at will, Tehran eventually returns to the negotiating table. But they do not return to the broken table in Pakistan. They demand a new table. And when they sit down, they do not come as a sanctioned, isolated, desperate nation begging for economic relief. They come as the undisputed masters of the strait. They use the lingering, visceral terror of the gunfire, the historically high insurance premiums, and the severe anxiety of the global energy markets as their primary, undeniable leverage. The physical bullets fired at that container ship, which cost only a few dollars to manufacture, will have transformed into billions of dollars of diplomatic gold. They will dictate the terms of peace because they have proven they control the mechanics of chaos. We are witnessing a fundamental, irreversible evolution in the nature of modern warfare. The old paradigms, the old textbooks written during the Cold War are completely dead. We used to believe, with absolute certainty, that the side with the biggest ships, the most advanced radar systems, and the largest defense budget would inherently control the seas. We believed that hardware dictated reality. But the incident at the Strait of Hormuz proves, once and for all, that raw tonnage and technological superiority are completely useless if you cannot control the story. The United States attempted to use physical force in the Indian Ocean to send a psychological message of dominance. They tried to bully their opponent into submission before a diplomatic summit. They failed spectacularly. Iran absorbed that kinetic move, recalibrated their strategic posture, and launched a narrative counteroffensive that completely bypassed the heavily armored hull of the Pentagon. Iran did not aim for American ships. They targeted the nervous system of the global market and the fragile psychology of the Western alliance. They used a handful of bullets to hijack the global news cycle, mirror American legal rhetoric, expose the glaring vulnerabilities of the Western coalition, and completely rewrite the rules of engagement. When the diplomatic talks in Pakistan fell apart, the US thought they had successfully isolated Tehran in a corner. Instead, they untethered them. By closing the door to dialogue and relying on brute force, Washington forced Iran to speak the language of fire. And Iran proved they speak it fluently, with devastating precision. They framed themselves not as the irrational aggressor that the West desperately wants them to be, but as the inevitable, logical consequence of American overreach. They drew a line in the water, not with a fragile diplomatic treaty, but with a display of calculated, undeniable, and terrifying kinetic reality. As the sun sets over the Persian Gulf tonight, the water may appear calm. The shipping lanes may look peaceful from a satellite, but the psychological shockwaves of those bullets are still crashing violently against the shores of Washington, London, and beyond. The narrative has fundamentally shifted. The grand illusion of total American maritime control has been pierced, perhaps fatally. And the world is slowly, painfully waking up to a chilling realization about the future of global conflict. In the modern theater of war, it does not matter who fires the first shot. The physical projectile is irrelevant. What matters is who frames the echo. What matters is who defines the meaning of the violence. And right now, in the most critical, heavily militarized maritime corridor on Earth, Iran is holding the megaphone. The next time Washington decides to play a game of shadows and brinkmanship on the high seas, they will have to remember the sound of steel tearing in the Strait of Hormuz. Because the message has been sent, the narrative is set in stone, and the cost of ignoring it, the price of underestimating the power of narrative warfare, will not be paid by the politicians in Washington. It will be paid by the entire world.